The transport trucks rumbled through the gates of Camp Concordia, Kansas, on the morning of December 20th, 1944. Hans Müller pressed his face against the cold canvas, watching guard towers materialize through falling snow. 32 years old, former schoolteacher from Heidelberg, now just another defeated soldier in American hands. The truck lurched to a stop at 6:15 in the morning. Hans stepped down onto frozen ground, his Wehrmacht uniform threadbare from months of retreat. Around him, 47 other German prisoners shuffled into formation, their breath forming clouds in the December cold. An American officer approached, speaking careful German. "Gentlemen, welcome to Camp Concordia. You will be processed, assigned barracks, and provided with winter clothing and food. We operate according to Geneva Convention standards." Hans translated quietly for the younger prisoners who spoke no English. His voice carried the authority of education, of someone accustomed to being heard. The others looked to him naturally, waiting for his interpretation not just of words, but of what this captivity would mean. Among them stood Wilhelm Richter, 19 years old, drafted in the final desperate months. The boy watched everything with wide eyes, still stunned by the speed of his capture at the Battle of the Bulge just 3 weeks earlier. He stayed close to Hans, seeking the reassurance an older man could provide. The processing building was warm. Hans felt his frozen fingers begin to burn as circulation returned. American guards directed them through medical examinations, paperwork, assignment of identification numbers. Everything was organized, efficient, unsettlingly professional. Hans had expected chaos, perhaps cruelty. Instead, he found bureaucracy. A medical officer checked Hans's teeth, listened to his lungs, asked about injuries. The man's hands were gentle, his manner clinical rather than hostile. He made notes on a clipboard, moved to the next prisoner. No interrogation, no threats, no violence, just procedure. By noon they stood in new barracks, wearing American-issued winter coats, facing the reality of indefinite captivity while war continued somewhere far beyond the Kansas prairie. The building smelled of fresh pine and coal smoke from the stove. Bunks lined both walls, each with a mattress, 2 blankets, and a pillow. Wilhelm touched his blanket tentatively, as if it might disappear. "Herr Müller," he whispered, "this is better than our barracks in France." Hans said nothing. He understood what the boy meant, but the observation troubled him. They had been prisoners for mere hours, and already the comparison favored their captors over their own army. That realization would need to be managed carefully if they were to maintain any sense of who they were. That first evening, Hans gathered the prisoners in the barracks after the American guards departed for their shift change at 7 o'clock. He spoke in German, his voice carrying the practiced cadence of classroom lectures delivered to students who needed guidance through confusion. "Listen carefully. We are prisoners, but we remain German soldiers. The Americans will try to make us comfortable. They will offer us kindness, perhaps even friendship. This is not generosity. This is strategy. They want us to forget who we are." The men sat on their bunks, some nodding, others uncertain. Wilhelm leaned forward from the back row, his young face troubled but attentive. "I taught literature for 8 years before this war," Hans continued. "Goethe, Schiller, Heine. I taught my students that German culture represents the pinnacle of Western civilization. Philosophy, music, poetry, science. While Americans were still shooting each other over cattle, we were producing Beethoven and Kant." Several prisoners murmured agreement. This was familiar territory, the cultural superiority they had been raised to believe. Hans recognized their need for this certainty, especially now when everything else had been stripped away. The Americans have material wealth, yes. They have factories and food and warmth. But they lack what we possess: depth of culture, centuries of tradition, the refinement that comes from true civilization. They are children with resources, nothing more. Hans paced between the bunks, warming to his theme. This was what he did best: frame chaos into comprehensible narrative, give frightened men something to hold on to. They will offer us their food, their entertainment, their casual friendship. We must refuse these things, not from spite, but from necessity. The moment we accept their culture, we lose our own. The moment we start thinking like Americans, we stop being German. Wilhelm raised his hand hesitantly, as if still in a classroom. Herr Müller, what if their treatment is more humane than what we experienced in our own army? The question hung in the air. Several prisoners looked uncomfortable. Hans recognized the danger immediately. The boy had voiced what others were thinking but afraid to say. Then we acknowledge reality but refuse to let it change us, Hans said carefully. A prisoner might eat better than a soldier in the field. That is circumstance, not moral judgment. What matters is maintaining our identity, our culture, our sense of who we are. Without that, we are nothing but bodies waiting to be shipped home. He could see he had not entirely convinced Wilhelm, but the others nodded more firmly now. They wanted this framework, needed someone to tell them how to survive captivity without surrendering their sense of self. We will be polite to our captors, we will follow their rules, but we will not become them. We will remember that we are German, and that means something more than they can understand. Do you all comprehend? A chorus of agreement filled the barracks. Hans felt the familiar satisfaction of a lesson successfully delivered. He had given them a way to maintain dignity in defeat, to preserve identity in captivity. Only Wilhelm remained silent, staring at his hands, and Hans made a mental note to speak with the boy privately. Young men were impressionable, and this one seemed dangerously open to American influence. December 23rd arrived cold and clear. At 8:30 in the morning, 2 American soldiers entered the barracks carrying wooden crates. The prisoners looked up from their bunks, some still finishing breakfast rations of coffee and bread. "Morning, gentlemen," said the younger soldier in broken German. "Commandant sends Christmas greetings. These are for you." They began distributing red and white striped sticks, hooked at one end, wrapped in cellophane. The objects caught morning light, creating small prisms of colour. "What is this?" asked one of the older prisoners, turning the item in his hands. "Candy cane," the American explained, miming unwrapping and eating. "American Christmas tradition, peppermint flavour." Hans rose from his bunk and approached. He accepted his candy cane with deliberate slowness, holding it up to examine it. The other prisoners watched, waiting for his response. "Coloured sugar on a stick," Hans said in German, loud enough for all to hear. This is what Americans consider culture. This is what they celebrate Christmas with, children's toys masquerading as tradition. Several prisoners laughed nervously. The American soldiers shifted uncomfortably. Hans continued, addressing his fellow prisoners. "Look at this absurdity. They take something as profound as the birth of Christ and reduce it to confectionery novelty. Red and white stripes. A hook shape for no reason. This is American civilization, shallow, commercial, and fundamentally unserious." He held the candy cane between 2 fingers, as if contaminated. "In Germany, we celebrate Christmas with depth and meaning, stollen that takes days to prepare, music that moves the soul. These people offer us twisted sugar and expect gratitude." Wilhelm watched from his bunk, his own candy cane still in his hands. He had already unwrapped one corner, curious about the smell. Now he stopped, uncertain. Hans walked to the small stove and dropped his candy cane into the coal bucket beside it. The cellophane crinkled as it fell among the black lumps. "We are German prisoners of war, not children to be pacified with sweets. Refuse these. Maintain your dignity." One by one, most prisoners followed Hans to the coal bucket, dropping their candy canes with varying degrees of conviction. Some looked regretful, others seemed relieved to have clear instruction. Wilhelm was the last to approach. He stood, holding his candy cane for a long moment, looking at Hans, then at the bucket, then back at the striped candy. Finally, He placed it gently on the windowsill beside his bunk, instead of throwing it away. Hans noted this small rebellion, but said nothing. The boy would learn. On the morning of December 24th, Camp Commandant Colonel Morrison called an assembly in the mess hall at 10 o'clock. Hans stood near the front, with Wilhelm beside him. Colonel Morrison stood before them, with translator Corporal Schmidt. The commandant spoke in English, pausing for translation. "Gentlemen, tomorrow is Christmas. I understand this is a difficult time to be away from home. However, the United States Army recognizes the importance of religious observance, even for prisoners of war." Schmidt translated, and the prisoners listened with cautious attention. "We will hold a Christmas celebration tomorrow evening at 6 o'clock. There will be a special meal, and our chaplain will conduct a service. We would like to make this celebration meaningful for all of you." Morrison paused. "We invite you to participate in planning the observance. If you would like to sing German Christmas carols, share readings, or contribute in your own language, we welcome your involvement." Murmurs rippled through the assembled prisoners. Hans felt his jaw tighten. "We will provide decorations, a Christmas tree, and traditional American foods," Morrison continued, "but we want to honor your traditions as well. Please speak with Corporal Schmidt if you wish to contribute." After Morrison dismissed them, prisoners clustered in small groups. Hans noticed several seemed excited, even grateful. This needed addressing immediately. He climbed onto a mess hall bench. "Brothers, listen to me." The conversations quieted. "The Americans offer us participation in their Christmas celebration. They present this as generosity, as respect. But consider what they are really doing. They want us to sing our songs in their building, share our sacred observances under their supervision, blend our culture with theirs until we can no longer distinguish between German and American." Wilhelm spoke up. "Herr Müller, is it not better to celebrate Christmas together than sit alone in our barracks? It is better to maintain our identity than trade it for their approval." Hans replied sharply. "They offer us Christmas, but on their terms, in their space, under their control. This is not respect. This is assimilation disguised as tolerance." He looked around. "I propose we refuse their invitation. We will conduct our own observance, in German, among ourselves, without their involvement. We will show them we do not need their permission to be who we are." "But Herr Müller," another prisoner objected, "the commandant specifically invited our participation." "And I specifically decline," Hans said. "Who stands with me?" Approximately 30 hands rose, some eagerly, others hesitantly. But nearly 20 prisoners kept their hands down, including Wilhelm. The camp was splitting. Christmas Day, 1944, passed with the camp divided. Hans led his faction in their own observance within the barracks, conducting prayers in German, singing Stille Nacht, without American participation. Through the windows, they heard the other group's voices blending with American soldiers, singing the same song in 2 languages. The harmony disturbed Hans deeply. Wilhelm had chosen to attend the American celebration. Hans watched him leave at 5:30, following other prisoners toward the decorated mess hall. The boy had not asked permission, he simply went. Over the following days, the division became more pronounced. Hans's group spoke only German, even when Americans were present. They refused the candy canes that continued appearing on their bunks. Wilhelm's group began attending English lessons 3 afternoons per week. They sat with Americans during meals, asked questions about Kansas and farming. Hans watched with growing alarm. On December 28th, Hans confronted Wilhelm at 8 o'clock in the evening, after the younger man returned from another English lesson. "You are forgetting yourself," Hans said in German. "Every day you become less German and more American." Wilhelm set down his English textbook. "I am learning their language, Herr Müller. That does not change who I am. Language shapes thought. Thought shapes identity. You cannot think in English without beginning to think like an American." "Perhaps that would not be entirely bad," Wilhelm said. then seemed to regret it immediately. Hans felt something cold settle in his chest. You think becoming American would not be bad? I think I am 19 years old, and I do not want to spend however long this war continues being angry at people who have done nothing but treat us with basic decency. Basic human decency is the minimum required by Geneva Convention. It is not friendship, it is obligation. Wilhelm picked up something from his footlocker. A candy cane, partially unwrapped, the peppermint smell faint but distinct. I tried one, Wilhelm admitted, 2 days ago. It was good, sweet but refreshing. The peppermint cleared my sinuses, which have been congested since we arrived. And I realized something. I have been cold and hungry and frightened for months. Years, perhaps. Here I am, warm and fed and safe, and you are asking me to be miserable on principle. I am asking you to remember who you are. I am Wilhelm Richter from Cologne. My father was a baker. My mother taught piano. I was drafted 8 months ago and captured 3 weeks later. That is who I am. Refusing a piece of candy does not make me more German. It only makes me more stubborn. Hans had no response that would not sound exactly like what Wilhelm had just accused him of being. He turned away, retreating to his own bunk, aware that he was losing this battle one prisoner at a time. On New Year's Day, 1945, Hans encountered Sergeant James Müller in the camp yard at 2 o'clock in the afternoon during his daily walk around the perimeter fence. Guten Tag, Herr Müller, the sergeant said in flawless German, not the broken German most American soldiers attempted, but the refined German of an educated native speaker. Hans stopped, surprised. Your German is excellent. It should be. I was born in Hamburg, came to America in 1938. So, you abandoned your homeland when it needed you most. Müller smiled without warmth. I left before it became what it has become. There is a difference. Hans studied the man. Müller was perhaps 40, with greying temples and the bearing of someone educated. Why did you approach me specifically? Corporal Schmidt says you are the teacher who speaks for the men refusing to participate. I wanted to understand what you hope to accomplish. I hope to preserve German identity and culture. Müller nodded. By refusing candy canes? By refusing to pretend that our captors are our friends. Müller leaned against the fence. I teach German literature at the University of Kansas. Goethe, Schiller, Heine, the same authors you once taught, I suspect. Hans felt drawn into conversation despite his instinct to maintain distance. And what do Americans make of Goethe? Some understand him, others struggle, but the point is they are willing to learn, to engage with a culture even while at war with the nation that produced it. That is easy for them. They are winning. It was not easy for me in 1939, when Germany invaded Poland and every German immigrant became suspect. My neighbours questioned my loyalty. The university considered dismissing me. But I remained because I understood something important. German culture and Nazi politics are not the same thing. One can love Goethe and hate Hitler. Hans felt anger rising. You speak as if Germany is solely responsible. I speak as someone who saw what was coming and left. I tried to warn friends, family, colleagues. Most did not listen. Müller's voice remained even, but Hans heard pain beneath. My parents refused to leave Hamburg. They died in a bombing raid last year. So do not lecture me about loyalty. The revelation silenced Hans momentarily. I approach you because I see something I recognize. A man using rigidity to cope with circumstances beyond his control. A man who has made his identity so inflexible that any compromise feels like betrayal. I was like that once. I am nothing like you, Hans said coldly. Perhaps not, but consider this. You refuse American friendship, culture, kindness, yet you accept American food, shelter, medical care. You have already compromised. You simply will not admit it. Müller pushed away from the fence. I will be here, speaking German, discussing literature, offering conversation when you tire of your own rigidity. Happy New Year, Herr Müller. He walked away, leaving Hans alone with thoughts he did not want to examine. 3 days later, on January 4th at 11 o'clock in the morning, Hans returned early from his walk to find the barracks unexpectedly occupied. Wilhelm sat on his bunk with 2 American soldiers, laughing. On the small table between them sat an open box of candy canes, several already unwrapped. Hans stood in the doorway, frozen. Wilhelm noticed him first, and the laughter died. The 2 Americans stood, nodded politely, and made their exit. After they left, silence filled the barracks. Wilhelm began rewrapping the candy canes. How long has this been happening? Hans asked coldly. 2 weeks, since the Christmas celebration. 2 weeks of fraternization with the enemy. Wilhelm looked up, defiance mixed with guilt on his face. You are not my commanding officer, Herr Müller. The war is over for us. The war is not over. We are still German soldiers. Duty to whom? Wilhelm stood, facing Hans. The Americans tell me stories about their homes. Private Johnson showed me photographs of his farm. They are not monsters. They are men like us who want to go home. They are the enemy. They were the enemy. Now they are simply the people treating us with more respect than our own officers showed us. Hans felt something crack inside his worldview. So you have chosen their side. I have chosen not to be miserable. Wilhelm picked up a candy cane. Private Johnson told me his grandmother makes these every Christmas. She boils sugar and peppermint oil, pulls it by hand until it forms stripes. It takes her 3 days to make enough for their family. Sentiment about candy does not change what we are. What are we, Herr Müller? Prisoners who will eventually be sent home to a country that no longer exists as we remember it. I choose not to spend my time hating people who have given me no reason for hatred. Wilhelm unwrapped the candy cane and held it out. Try one. Not to betray Germany, not to become American, but simply to taste something sweet in a world that has been bitter for too long. Hans stared at the offered candy, seeing everything he had fought against. But he also saw Wilhelm's face, open and earnest, waiting. I cannot, Hans said finally. Wilhelm lowered his hand. Then you have chosen your own kind of captivity, Herr Müller, and it is worse than anything the Americans have imposed on us. On January 8th, 1945, at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Corporal Schmidt appeared in the barracks doorway holding a bundle of letters. Red Cross mail had arrived. Müller, Hans, Schmidt called. Hans took the letter with trembling hands. The handwriting was not his wife's. He recognized his brother-in-law's script, and his stomach tightened. He sat on his bunk and opened the envelope. The letter was dated November 27th, written 6 weeks earlier. Dear Hans, I write with the heaviest of hearts. On November 14th, Allied bombers struck our district. Your home took a direct hit. Margaretha was killed instantly. The authorities assure me she did not suffer. The words blurred. Hans forced himself to continue. Your school is gone as well, destroyed in the same raid. The Heidelberg you remember no longer exists. I am sorry, your brother, Friedrich. Hans sat motionless, the letter loose in his hands. Around him, other prisoners opened their own mail, some crying, some laughing, most simply absorbing news. Wilhelm approached cautiously. Herr Müller, bad news? My wife is dead. My home is destroyed. My school is gone. I am so sorry. Hans looked at Wilhelm, then around the warm barracks. I have spent 3 weeks fighting to preserve a Germany that no longer exists. Refusing American kindness to maintain loyalty to a country that could not protect my wife. He stood, walked to the window, stared out at the Kansas prairie dusted with snow. What was I preserving, Wilhelm? Wilhelm had no answer. Everything I taught my students about German culture, about our superior civilization, where did it lead? My wife is dead because of that civilization. My city is rubble because of that culture. He turned back. And I have been refusing candy canes, as if that refusal meant something, as if maintaining that small, rigid principle could somehow preserve what has already been destroyed. The other prisoners watched in silence. Hans Müller, their spokesman for resistance, was fracturing before their eyes. I do not know what to do now, Hans said quietly. I do not know who I am if I am not a German teacher from Heidelberg with a wife and a school. Wilhelm picked up the candy cane from his footlocker, the one Hans had refused days earlier. He held it out again, without argument, simply an offer of something sweet in a moment of unbearable bitterness. Hans looked at it for a long moment. Then, slowly, he reached out and took it. The candy cane sat untouched on Hans's bunk for 2 days. On January 10th, at breakfast time, Hans made a decision that would define the next week. He stood in the mess hall at 7:30 and announced, I am refusing all meals until the Americans acknowledge that we are prisoners, not their friends. 23 men joined the strike. The others quietly separated themselves from Hans's leadership. Sergeant Müller was called at 9 o'clock. Herr Müller, refusing food is not forbidden under Geneva Convention, but it is not something we can ignore. We ask you to acknowledge what we are, enemies, not guests. You are prisoners of war, being treated according to international law. Then stop trying to make us like you. Stop the candy, the celebrations, the English lessons. Müller looked at the assembled men. I will report your demands, but starving yourselves changes nothing except your own health. The first day passed with relative ease. Most had experienced hunger during the war's final months. The second day brought discomfort, stomachs cramped, heads ached, but pride kept them committed. Hans walked through the barracks, encouraging the others. By the third day, January 13th, the weakness was pronounced. Several men lay on their bunks, unable to stand. The camp doctor examined them at 2 o'clock and reported his concerns. Wilhelm visited Hans that evening with water. Herr Müller, this proves nothing. You are not hurting the Americans, only yourselves. Sometimes suffering is the only language that cannot be misunderstood. But what are you trying to say? That you would rather die than accept kindness? That seems less like strength and more like stubbornness. Hans had no answer that did not sound exactly like what Wilhelm suggested. He drank the water silently. By the fourth day, 3 men had quit. 2 more required medical intervention. Hans could see the others wavering. On the 5th day, January 15th, Hans woke to find 7 more had abandoned the strike overnight. Only 13 remained. His vision swam when he stood. His hands trembled constantly. Sergeant Müller visited again at 10 o'clock. Herr Müller, Colonel Morrison says, if you end this strike now, there will be no punishment. You have made your point. What point have I made? That you are willing to suffer for principle. That is admirable, even if misguided. But continuing serves no purpose except damaging your health. Hans looked at the remaining strikers, their hollow eyes and weakened bodies. He had led them into this. Pride or responsibility, which mattered more? I need time to consider, Hans said hoarsely. You have until morning formation tomorrow. After that we will be forced to intervene medically. After Müller left, Hans sat on his bunk and stared at the candy cane still resting on his footlocker. A symbol of everything he had fought against, now transformed into a question he could no longer avoid answering. That evening at 6 o'clock, Sergeant Müller returned to the barracks. Hans lay on his bunk, weak from 5 days without food. The other strikers were scattered throughout the space, some sleeping, others lying still. Müller pulled up a chair beside Hans's bunk. He spoke in German, his voice low and direct. Herr Müller, I need to tell you something, not as a guard to a prisoner, but as one German to another. Hans turned his head slightly. You think you are punishing us with this strike, but I have been watching what you are actually doing. Müller gestured toward the other strikers. You are not punishing the Americans. Colonel Morrison sleeps soundly. The kitchen staff continues their work. We are concerned about your health, but we are not suffering. Hans said nothing. You are punishing them. Müller pointed to the weakened men. Men who followed you because they trusted your education. Men who are now starving because they believed you knew the right path. They chose to follow, Hans whispered hoarsely. Did they? Or did you make it impossible for them to choose otherwise? You framed acceptance as betrayal, compromise as weakness. You gave them no dignified way to survive, except through your rigid principles. Müller leaned forward. I recognized something in you. The man I was in 1938, so certain of my principles that I was willing to drag others down rather than admit I might be wrong. You abandoned your country. I saved myself from drowning alongside people determined to sink. Müller's voice remained calm. And now you are captaining a ship that is already sunk, demanding that your crew drown with you rather than swim to shore. Hans closed his eyes. What would you have me do? End this strike, feed your men, then decide who you want to be in the years ahead, not who you needed to be in the years behind. Müller stood. You have until morning formation. But understand this. If you continue, we will force-feed you. It will be unpleasant and humiliating. You will accomplish nothing except proving that stubbornness and strength are not the same thing. He walked toward the door, then paused. Your wife would not want you to die over a piece of candy. Honor her memory by choosing life, even if it means admitting you were wrong. After Müller left, the barracks remained silent. Hans lay motionless, knowing that morning would require a choice he could no longer avoid. Hans did not sleep that night. At 6 o'clock on January 16th, he heard movement outside the barracks. The door opened. Wilhelm entered, carrying a tray with bread and coffee. He had been doing this every morning, bringing food that no one would eat. Herr Müller, Wilhelm said quietly, please, eat something. Hans turned away. Wilhelm set the tray down and began checking on the other strikers, offering water, speaking gentle encouragement. Then Hans heard a sound that made his blood freeze, a thud followed by the crash of a water pitcher. He sat up and saw Wilhelm lying on the ground, motionless. Several prisoners rushed over. Hans forced himself to stand and made his way to where Wilhelm lay. The boy's face was pale, his breathing shallow. Friedrich, a former medic, checked his pulse. His heart rate is very slow. He needs medical attention immediately. He is not on strike, Hans said. He has been eating. Friedrich looked up grimly. Look at him, really look. Hans knelt beside Wilhelm and saw what he had been too absorbed to notice. The boy's uniform hung loose. His cheekbones were too prominent. Wilhelm had been eating, but barely, giving much of his rations away to convince the strikers to break their fast. He has been starving himself to feed us, Hans whispered. He has been trying to save you, Friedrich corrected, and it has been killing him. American guards arrived within minutes. Captain Reynolds took one look at Wilhelm and called for a stretcher. They carried the unconscious boy toward the infirmary. Hans stood frozen in the doorway, watching. The boy who had challenged him, who had offered him candy. The boy who had nearly died trying to bridge the gap Hans's rigidity had created. Sergeant Müller appeared beside him. This is what your principles have cost. Not just your own suffering, but the suffering of someone who cared enough to destroy himself, trying to save you. Hans looked at the remaining strikers. He looked at the tray Wilhelm had brought, the bread still warm. He walked to the table, picked up a piece of bread, and ate it. The other strikers watched in silence as their leader broke the fast. Some looked relieved, others betrayed, but Hans no longer cared. He cared only about getting to the infirmary, about seeing if Wilhelm would survive. After finishing the bread, Hans turned to the remaining strikers. The strike is over. Eat. That is an order. Then he walked out into the January morning, heading toward the infirmary, where a 19-year-old boy lay fighting for his life because he had been too kind to abandon the man who had been too rigid to accept help. Hans was forbidden from entering the infirmary for 3 hours. Captain Reynolds insisted on stabilizing Wilhelm first. Hans sat on a bench outside, still weak from 6 days without food, watching the morning sun climb higher. At 9:30, a nurse told him he could enter. Hans followed her to a small room at the back of the building. Wilhelm lay in a narrow bed, connected to an intravenous drip. His eyes were closed, his breathing regular but shallow. The blue tinge had left his lips, but he still looked fragile. Hans pulled a chair close and sat down heavily. He watched the boy's chest rise and fall, each breath a small reassurance. After 20 minutes, Wilhelm's eyes opened. He turned his head slowly, saw Hans, and attempted a weak smile. "You ate the bread," Wilhelm said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I ate the bread," Hans confirmed. "Good." Wilhelm closed his eyes again, exhausted. Hans waited, needing to say what had been building inside him. "Why did you do it?" Hans asked quietly. "Why did you give away your food to stubborn men who refused to listen?" Wilhelm opened his eyes again. "Because you are not just stubborn men, you are frightened men trying to hold on to the only thing you think you have left, your identity." He paused to catch his breath. "I understood that, Herr Müller, but I also understood something else. We can hold on to who we were so tightly that we forget to become who we need to be." Hans felt something break inside him. "I have been wrong about many things." "Not wrong, just inflexible." Wilhelm managed another smile. "There is a difference." "Is there? My inflexibility nearly killed you. But you learned from it. You are here. You ate the bread. You ended the strike. These are not small things." A nurse entered with medication. Hans stood to leave, but Wilhelm held on to his hand. "The candy cane," Wilhelm said. "Is it still on your footlocker?" "Yes." "Good. Try it when you are ready. Not because I want you to become American, but because sometimes a piece of candy is just a piece of candy." Hans left the infirmary as the sun reached its zenith. He walked back to the barracks slowly, his body weak, but his mind clear. The candy cane still sat where he had left it, red and white stripes catching the afternoon light. He picked it up, unwrapped it carefully, and took a small taste. It was sweet, refreshing. The peppermint cleared his sinuses, and he realized Wilhelm was right. Sometimes a piece of candy was just a piece of candy. The symbolic weight he had given it had existed only in his own rigid thinking. He sat on his bunk and finished the candy cane, tasting peppermint and possibility. On January 18th, at 10 o'clock, Colonel Morrison summoned Hans to his office. Sergeant Müller accompanied him through the camp yard in silence. Morrison's office was spare, a desk, 2 chairs, an American flag. Morrison gestured for Hans to sit. "Herr Müller, the hunger strike was within your rights under Geneva Convention. We cannot punish you for exercising those rights." Hans waited, sensing more. "However, the strike endangered 23 men. 1 nearly died trying to care for you. The physician has recommended measures to prevent future incidents." Morrison slid a document across the desk. Hans read carefully. Regular medical examinations, psychological counselling, and a prisoner committee to address grievances. "These seem reasonable," Hans said quietly. "There is one more condition, not mandatory, but an opportunity." Hans looked up. "Sergeant Müller proposes that you assist with prisoner orientation. Help newly arriving Germans understand that American treatment is not what propaganda told them." The irony was clear. The man who had resisted most was being asked to facilitate adaptation. "Why would you trust me with this?" Morrison leaned forward. "Because you understand both sides now. You know what it feels like to resist, and what it costs. That makes you uniquely qualified." Hans thought of Wilhelm, still recovering. He thought of the men who had followed him into pointless strike. "I accept," Hans said, "with one condition." "Which is?" That Wilhelm Richter, when he recovers, assists me. He has the gift I lack, kindness without compromising principle. Together, perhaps we can help others find balance. Morrison smiled slightly. Agreed. Report to Sergeant Miller tomorrow at 8 o'clock. Hans stood, then hesitated. Colonel, may I ask you something? Of course. Why treat enemy prisoners with such care when it would be easier to simply warehouse us? Morrison walked to the window. Because the war will end eventually. When it does, we will need to live in the same world as our former enemies. The way we treat you now will determine whether that world has hope of peace. He turned back. We are not just imprisoning Germans. We are trying to show you that democracy and human dignity are worth defending. That is how we win the peace, not just the war. Hans left understanding that he had received his second education. That afternoon, Hans did not report to the barracks. Instead, he walked the perimeter, circling the fence in the cold January air, wrestling with thoughts that had no resolution. He had agreed to help orient new prisoners. He had eaten the candy cane. He had ended the strike. On the surface, practical decisions. But Hans understood they represented something deeper. He had surrendered the rigid framework that had defined his life, the belief that German culture was superior, the conviction that compromise was weakness. He stopped and gripped the fence, staring at the Kansas prairie. Somewhere beyond that horizon was Germany, except it was not his anymore. The Germany he had taught about had coexisted with something monstrous. He had known about the persecution, the violence, the nationalism. He had told himself these were temporary excesses. But it had not been temporary. It had been fundamental, and he had been complicit through silence. Wilhelm had nearly died because of Hans's rigidity. His wife was dead because of a war Hans had supported passively. The students he had taught were scattered, dead, or corrupted by ideas he had failed to challenge. What did it mean to admit all of this? Hans sat in the snow, his back against the fence, a teacher without students, a husband without a wife, a German without Germany. Sergeant Miller found him there an hour later. The sergeant sat beside him without speaking. I do not know who I am anymore, Hans said finally. Good, Miller replied. Hans looked at him, surprised. The man you were led those prisoners into pointless strike, the man you were valued being right more than being kind, you should not want to be that man anymore. But if I am not that man, who am I? Someone who is still being discovered, someone who has courage to admit he was wrong, someone who might help others avoid his mistakes. Miller stood and offered his hand. That seems like someone worth becoming, Herr Müller. Hans took the hand and pulled himself up. His legs were numb from sitting in the snow, his mind exhausted from confronting truths he had avoided. Tomorrow morning, at 8 o'clock, Miller said. New prisoners arrive at 9. They will be frightened and confused, just as you were. The difference is that you will be there to help them understand that accepting help is not betraying who they are. Hans walked back to the barracks as dusk settled over the camp. He did not have answers yet about who he was becoming. But for the first time in his life, he understood that not having answers might be the beginning of wisdom rather than the absence of it. The next morning, at 9 o'clock, 32 new German prisoners arrived at Camp Concordia. Hans stood beside Sergeant Miller and Wilhelm, who had been released from the infirmary that morning against medical advice. The new arrivals looked exactly as Hans had 3 weeks earlier, frightened, defiant, uncertain. Colonel Morrison conducted the official welcome, then gestured to Hans. This is Hans Müller, a prisoner like yourselves. He will help orient you. Hans stepped forward. He saw suspicion immediately. A collaborator, a traitor. My name is Hans Müller, he began in German. I was a schoolteacher in Heidelberg, captured at the Battle of the Bulge. I have been here 3 weeks. He let them see him clearly, his Wehrmacht uniform, his military bearing. When I arrived, I believed everything propaganda told me. I believed they would torture us, starve us. I was wrong. Murmurs rippled through them. One man spoke sharply. So you have become American? No, I have become honest. He gestured around. You will be fed 3 meals daily, better than what you ate in the Wehrmacht. You will have warm beds, medical care. You will be treated according to Geneva Convention standards. This is a trick, another insisted. I thought the same. I refused their kindness for weeks. I organized a hunger strike. Do you know what the Americans did? They waited. They let me strike. They did not punish me until my stubbornness endangered my life and others who followed me. When I ended it, they offered me this position. Wilhelm stepped forward, still weak. Herr Müller nearly let me die defending principles that had nothing to do with honor. He confused rigidity with strength. Accepting help does not make you a traitor. Hans could see them struggling, but their eyes told a story. They could see the clean barracks, smell the food, feel the warmth. I am not asking you to love Americans or forget you are German. I am asking you to survive with your humanity intact. The war is lost. What matters now is who you will be when you return home. He pulled out a candy cane. 3 weeks ago, I destroyed one of these because I thought accepting it meant surrendering my identity. Last week, I tried one. I discovered it was just candy, sweet, harmless. All the meaning I assigned existed only in my rigid thinking. He held it up. Who you are is not determined by whether you eat American candy. It is determined by how you treat others, how you face hardship, and whether you have courage to admit when you are wrong. Hans offered it to the older prisoner. I am not asking you to eat this. I am asking you to think about what refusing it accomplishes. The man stared, then slowly took it. Thank you, Herr Müller. Hans turned back. Welcome to Camp Concordia. I hope your stay teaches you what mine taught me, that we are more than our worst moments and capable of becoming better than we were. On January 20th, 1 month after the original celebration Hans had boycotted, the camp held a second Christmas gathering. This time, it was a proposal from the prisoner committee that Hans now co-chaired with Wilhelm. The mess hall was decorated with pine branches and paper chains. American and German prisoners had worked together preparing the space. Hans stood at the entrance at 6 o'clock, watching prisoners file in. The new arrivals mingled with the original group, divisions fading. Sergeant Müller approached with candy canes. I thought perhaps you would like to hand them out this time. Hans took the tray. He moved through the hall, offering candy canes. Some accepted eagerly, others hesitantly. A few refused, and Hans did not press them. The older prisoner from the new group approached. My name is Ernst Weber. I was a professor of history in Munich. What did you teach? German nationalism, the superiority of our culture. Weber smiled sadly. I taught lies, just as you did. We are both educators who must now unlearn what we taught. What will you teach when you return? The truth, that nationalism without humanity becomes barbarism. Wilhelm had organized the program, German carols in German, American carols in English, then several songs in both languages. The harmony was imperfect but genuine. Hans stood between Wilhelm and Sergeant Müller, 3 men who had taught each other lessons about rigidity and flexibility. Thank you, Hans said quietly. For what? Müller asked. For not giving up on me when I had given up on myself. Wilhelm smiled. You would have figured it out eventually. Intelligence and wisdom are different things. I had plenty of the first and none of the second. Later, Hans walked across the compound. The January night was cold but clear. He thought of his wife, dead in Heidelberg, his students, scattered or lost, the Germany he had known, gone forever. But he also thought of tomorrow, when he would help more prisoners understand that survival required adaptation, that identity was flexible, that who they had been mattered less than who they chose to become. In his pocket was a candy cane. He would eat it later, marking how far he had come. The candy cane was still just candy, but sometimes the smallest things carried the largest meanings.